Okay, guys, today I'm going to be talking about slavery in the Bible, and this is going to be a topic I think is very important for most people to know because, again, it's one of those things that we believe in, and we have to be able to defend what we believe in because otherwise, I mean, for one, if we don't understand what we believe, it's going to be hard to defend it. But two, if we can't defend what we believe, then we can't share what we believe, right? If you don't know what you believe and you don't know it well enough, you can't defend it and you can't share it, which is the goal. The goal is to share the gospel, not because we want to seem smart or educated, but because we want to help people, because we understand that the way we live naturally is not that of the way of life. It is the way of death. So, without further ado, we're going to get into it by talking about the verse that people often think incites the fact that God approves of slavery. There are other verses as well, like the verse in Timothy, um, but we're going to start off here in Leviticus. Right, we're going to start here. So the full chapter. This is the old Levitical law. So this was a law that we are no longer bound by. And another thing to understand, the first thing I want to make very clear when talking about the Levitical law is that a lot of these things were done not because God inherently like approved of it, but more so the fact that he just understood that we're human and that we are hard headed and we're hard of heart. To be hard of heart means this. It means that we don't like to submit at any given cost. We'll do whatever we can to get what we want. We're difficult to work with is the best way to put it, right? And there's some things we won't listen to even if we're told not to do it. To give an example of this, give an example later. But anyway, if any of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger so that you can continue to live among them, right? It's very important that you read this entire chapter in context because even before they even start talking about the idea of possessing slaves, they talk about the fact that as you would a foreigner and stranger, treat them and support them. Right. So already God isn't sitting there telling people that they should be treating foreigners with any type of disgust or any type of special refrain. He's telling them that if you see a foreigner, you support them and you treat them with kindness. Right. You're not a people. You're not like the other people. Every other nation around them, they were meant to be set apart, and other nations around them were doing stuff that was not of God. Right. So, if any of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells themselves to you, you do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans, to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. If a foreigner resides among you, if a foreigner resides among you and becomes rich, and any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to the foreigner or to a member of the foreigner's clan, they retain their right of redemption after they have sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them, an uncle or cousin or any blood relative in the clan may redeem them. Or if they prosper, they may redeem themselves. They and their buyer are to count the time for the year they sold themselves up to the year of Jubilee. The price for their release is to be based on the rate paid to a hired worker for that number of years. If many years remain, they must pay for their redemption a larger share of the price paid for them. If only a few years remain until the year of Jubilee, they are to compute that and pay for their redemption accordingly. They are to be treated as workers hired from year to year. You must see to it that those to whom they owe service do not rule over them ruthlessly. If someone is not redeemed in any of these ways and their children are to be released in the year of Jubilee, for the Israelites belong to me as servants, they are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So if you read this at first glance, it really does look like God saying, oh yeah, go ahead for slavery, right? Sure. But two things you need to understand. First of all, there's a lot of context behind this. And the second thing is this. The Israelites back then, this was written for people years, decades, a millennia before our time. So they understood exactly what God was saying when they read this. They didn't think, oh yeah, God says slavery is cool. No, what they understood was that God was putting regulation on what they were going to practice because he knew they were going to practice it anyway, even though he told them not to. I'll finish this point I'm making right now, then I'll go on to the next point I just made, which is that he knew they were going to anyway, so he still made regulation for it, right? So to capitalize on what I'm saying here, I'm saying this. God said, I know you're going to buy slaves because everyone around you is doing it. I know that's not, I'm me telling you not to do is not going to stop you. So what's going to happen is if you do it, you're going to do it this way. One of the things he mentions is that no one shall rule over them ruthlessly. You must see to it that those to whom they owe service do not rule over them ruthlessly. This is talking about all people who are indentured servants or slaves, right? In this time period, slavery was not the same type of slavery we think of today. It wasn't the slavery you think of when you watch movies where they talk about lynching and stuff, right? Slavery was very common back then, but at the same time, people sold themselves into slavery, right? Which is basically a job. That's what that is. It's like basically a job. Now, it's not the same kind of job you think of today, but it's still a job. They sold themselves into slavery because they had a debt to pay or because they wanted to live. That's it. They wanted to live. They wanted to eat food. They wanted to have water. They wanted to be able to support themselves, right? And when they were slaves, they had that stuff, as opposed to slaves in the future, like a couple hundred years ago, that were it was entirely different, right? And again, there are other verses that people will read in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and say, "Oh my gosh, that sounds extremely terrible and crazy." But when you read the context and understand why God is saying this stuff and why He inspired Moses to write this stuff, it's not because God is sitting there trying to be evil. It's because He's trying to accommodate for the fact that He knows we're evil. He knows we're going to practice slavery, so He's going to say, "Okay, if you're going to practice it, you're going to do it this way. You're not going to practice slavery like other nations practice slavery. You're not going to practice the same slavery that was done to you in Egypt." As I'm going to tell you to do, which if you pay attention here, none of the stuff that happened in Egypt is going to happen to the people that are going to be taken as slaves. And if it does happen, someone's going to tell them about it. Again, the Israelites were directly under God and they were supposed to be set apart. So that means that if someone caught someone treating a slave or an indentured worker bad, they were going to get punished for that. God wasn't going to let that slide. And the people weren't going to either. Because again, people at the specific time in Leviticus, during the Levitical law, valued, and I shouldn't say valued, they put it above all else that people were not caught in sin. Because again, that looks bad on all of them if they're letting that happen. So to put it simply, slavery in this time period is not the same type of slavery that we think of today. Not even close. Not even close. Again, one of the things it mentions is that people sold themselves into slavery. The slavery we think of now, no one sells himself into slavery today. No one does that. I mean, unless you want to consider that a 9 to 5, but that's kind of comical at that point. But anyway, no one sells himself into slavery today because it's a different time. Back then, that was a very common thing to do, to sell yourself into slavery so that you could get money and food. And I really shouldn't say money, but really food and water and a place to live. That was the whole point of this law. It wasn't to sit there and make human beings footstools for other human beings. Again, human beings are made in God's image. So what that means is this. It means that God never intended for us to be ruling over one of each other like slaves. There's a hierarchy, of course, in modern day life, but He never intended for you to have entire rule over someone's entire life and should treat them ruthlessly at that. That's not at all what He intended, right? Again, you can read this entire chapter and see this clearly isn't talking about the same type of slavery we think of today. For one, no one sells themselves into slavery today. They're always taken into slavery, right? And it mentions that you will buy them. Again, the reason why it's saying buy them is because people would sell themselves into slavery. So yeah, I mean, of course, that's not to sit there and say that there weren't people who were treated like slaves in this time period, like the slaves of the day. That's 100% a thing because the Israelites were just freed from Egypt from that. God just freed them from that. That's why He's sitting there saying, okay, I just freed you from that type of slavery. Don't ever practice that again. Don't ever practice that again because if you do, that makes me look bad. And if you do that and I catch you doing that, you're in trouble, right? But again, I've kind of been beating a dead horse here. I feel like you understand it. If you don't, well, you can ask questions or whatever you feel like doing. But again, the whole point of this is to help you understand that this isn't the same type of slavery that people think it is. The Bible has a lot of context and historical context. And again, when people read the Bible at the time, they understood what they were supposed to be doing. People nowadays don't understand because they don't look for context and they don't read the entirety of it. If you read the entirety of the Bible, you'd understand slavery was never meant to be a thing that God instituted in people. That's something that people institute on themselves. Later on in the Bible, Jesus says, because of your hardness of heart, the Levitical law that Moses wrote was the way it was. For example, I'll give you multiple examples. People were never meant to divorce. Whenever you hear someone at a wedding, you'll hear them say this. You'll hear them say, oh, do you promise to stay with this person no matter what? They don't ever say, and then if this happens, you can divorce. That's not like, in the wedding vows, you say till death do us part. There's a reason why you say that. It's because that's how it was supposed to be. You were never supposed to divorce the person you marry. Henceforth, that means that if you married someone, you better have picked the right person to marry. You shouldn't have just married whoever you saw. You married the right person because it was a covenant that was supposed to last forever, till death do you part. We don't understand things the way God intended for us to understand them. And that's because of our hardness of heart. We do things the way we want to do things, even when God tells us not to. For example, God says that marriage will be done within a man and a wife. We don't practice that at all, right? We don't. And even beyond that, it was obviously intended that when you were married to someone, you could then have sex with them, not before, right? God never directly said, And actually, he did directly say it. I shouldn't say he didn't. He didn't say it in the words Don't have sex with anybody." No, what he said is adultery, and what he also said is, "Do not have sex outside of marriage because that's adultery. If you're not married to that person, and you're having sex outside of marriage, that's adultery, right?" Granted, he told them not to do that. He also made regulations in the case that they did do that because he knew they were going to do it anyway. And I'll prove my point. Let's go to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 21, I believe. Yeah. Okay. Actually, no, this is the wrong Deuteronomy verse. And this is actually a good verse because this is one of those verses, again, people tend to misunderstand, right? This is Deuteronomy 22, verse 28. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her, right? So the first thing that's going to tick people off and make them upset is that they see the word rape. Now, what I want to show you is this cool thing. It's called translations. There's translations. There's word for word translations, and there's thought for thought translations. A word for word translation means that they're going to find the closest word they can to the word that they're originally looking for, which means it's not always going to be accurate. So you're going to get confused when you look at the word, right? A thought for thought translation means that it's going to be exactly what the person thought at the time and what it would be now, right? This is an example of a word for word translation. And if you were to scroll to a different translation of the Bible, like for example, like, let's see, Common English, grabs her and has sex with her. Yeah, it doesn't even use the word rape. So my point exactly. Translations matter because some translations will use words that we don't understand why they're using that word, but actually we do understand why they're using the word. We understand it because that's the closest word they have. Like they don't have a word, whatever that was translated from. They don't have a word for just grabs and sex. That the word they chose is the word they chose, right? That's why we have translations, and it's not because we won't have different versions of the Bible. The Bible doesn't have different versions because it doesn't just change from Tuesday to Wednesday between those times. It stays the same. The whole point of translations is that each and every person across the planet can understand it. And whenever someone's confused, they can go to a different translation and say, "Oh, okay, I understand that now. That makes sense. I didn't understand that before," right? Again, understanding the Bible really comes down to how much research you are willing to put in and how much time and effort you're willing to put in. Also understanding. To give you an example of how you can take anything out of context, women back in Japan, back around when Americans, and even before that, but specifically when Americans had discovered Japan, I shouldn't say discovered, you can't discover what already exists, but when Americans had made it to Japan, one of the things we noticed is that they painted their teeth black. Unfortunately, in Japan, they had a terrible view on how valuable women were. So what that view was is that they were really only for sex and for children. Unfortunately, it was a terrible time to be a woman in that time period. It was terrible, right? But anyway, most every woman was in some way going to be sent or exposed to prostitution, right? But they had a way to say that one prostitute or one woman is higher than other women, which is to blacken their teeth. If your teeth were blackened, that meant one of two things: you were extremely valuable prostitute, or you were about to be married to somebody. Blackening the teeth was to show that you were specifically different from them, right? It's very hard to miss black teeth. On top of the fact, they also happen to believe that black teeth made it. It was they thought it would make your teeth cleaner, which I have no idea why they thought that, but they did. I don't think that's at all how you make your teeth cleaner. I think you just brush your teeth and you clean them. But again, that was a long time ago, like a long, long time ago. And we don't practice that. They don't practice that anymore. I hope they don't. But again, when you look at things at first sight, it's like, oh, that's stupid. Oh, that's where they practiced that. Now, in this case, it was a bad thing they practiced it because again, it was in coercion and it was in cooperation with the whole thing of prostitution, which again wasn't a great thing. For example, people might say the Bible never says that you shouldn't prostitute people. It does. One of the things the Bible actually says in Deuteronomy and Leviticus is that you shouldn't prostitute your daughter because that will, one, it violates her and violates you and violates the land, right? A lot of things God doesn't directly say, but it's very clear He doesn't intend to. When you look at how much God values each and every one of us, it's very clear He never intended for us to invoke slavery and shit. That's something only humans will do, right? Just because I don't tell you to do something doesn't mean I support that thing. Just because I don't tell you to not crash your car into people and kill them does not mean I support that, right? In any given case, I probably told you never to kill people, and that falls in line of not killing people, right? When I tell you to treat people with kindness, that falls in line of not enslaving people. I shouldn't have to directly tell you not to enslave people, right? And another thing I want to make note of: the reason why slavery is bad isn't because humans say it's bad; it's because God says it's bad. Because again, that comes down to not treating someone the way you want to be treated. That comes down to treating someone less than human. And again, we're all human and we're all made in the image of God. So if you are practicing slavery on somebody, you are not practicing love of God in that person. Right? And here's to capitalize on my point again. There is a whole book of the Bible talking about this. I shouldn't say talking about this, but referencing it, right? And in this book of the Bible, it's Philemon. Paul writes a letter to Philemon. Paul has seed Onesimus. Onesimus is a slave of Philemon. Onesimus ran away from Philemon because he was scared and didn't want to be killed to him, right? So basically, I'll read the entire chapter just because we have the time here. So, Paul, a prisoner of Christ, and Timothy, our brother, to Philemon, our dear friend and fellow worker, also to Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church that meets in your home. Grace and peace to you from God, our Father, and the Lord Jesus Christ. Thanksgiving and prayer. I always thank my God as I remember you in my prayers because I hear about your love for all his holy people and your faith in the Lord Jesus. I pray that your partnership with us in faith may be effective in deepening your understanding of every good thing we share for the sake of Christ. Your love has given me great joy and encouragement because you, brother, have refreshed the hearts of the Lord's people. Paul's plea for Onesimus. Therefore, although in Christ I could be bold in order to do what you ought to do. To do what you ought to do. Yet I prefer to appeal to you on a basis of love. It is as of none other than Paul, an old man and now is also a prisoner of Christ, that I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, who because my son while I was in chains who became my son while I was in chains. Formerly he was useless to you, but now he has become useful both to you and me. I am sending him, who is my very heart, back to you. I would have liked to keep him with me so that he could take your place in helping me while I am in chains for the gospel, but I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that any favor you do would not seem forced, but would be voluntary. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but as better than a slave, as a dear brother. He is very dear to me, even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and as a brother in the Lord. So it is clear that it was never God's intention to actually have people practice slavery, but he knew he would do it. So what he did was he gave us revelation so that we wouldn't be the monsters that the Egyptians were to us. And I really should say Israelites, not us, but the monsters that Egyptians were to Israelites, and the monsters that people were in, unfortunately, the 90s and the 80s to African Americans and to other slaves all around the world. Slavery is still unfortunately practiced in the world. But again, if you read the Bible, it is very clear that God never intended for that to happen. And it's very clear that there were plenty of things that God never intended to happen. For example, he never intended for people to divorce. Jesus makes note of that. He said because your hearts were so hardened, he allowed you to do that because he knew you would do it anyway. And he had regulations for if you did do it, so you wouldn't do it in a way that made it more disgraceful than it already was. So again, the Bible doesn't endorse slavery. The Bible regulates it. Regulation isn't approval of something. It's just saying, I know people are going to practice anyway, but we're going to make sure this goes the way it should be going. Better than what you're going to practice. And in that, it did. If you study history, you'll find out that slavery ended in America because of a Christian man, that being Abraham Lincoln. The question you're going to ask is, why didn't the forefathers do this? Because, again, I couldn't tell you why. I would assume the reason why they didn't do it is because at the time, they probably wouldn't have had the approval of all the other states at the time. It'd be a very hard thing to implement, but eventually it was implemented. It wasn't implemented by an atheist. It wasn't implemented by someone who was from Islam. It wasn't implemented by a Buddhist. It was implemented by someone who was God-fearing. So, my point being this, God never intended for slavery to be something we practice, but we want to practice slavery. That's something we inherently as humans want to do because we're lazy and because we're evil and because we don't value each other the way God values us. So, that is the end of this Bible study. I hope this was helpful to you guys. There were plenty of other things to study in the Levitical law and Deuteronomy and Numbers and so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that happen in the Bible that people just don't do research on. And, if they're not going to do research on it, I will. So, yeah. Anyway, praying for you guys out there. And I'm going to try to do this more consistently. So, yeah. Love you guys. Praying for you guys. Amen.